The envelope was thin, plain white, and tucked neatly beneath his front door. At first, David thought it was just another circular, a real estate flyer, maybe a bill. But the bold red letters at the top made him pause. Notice of violation. He turned it over slowly. His name, his address, and below it, the reason for the fine. Unmaintained yard. Non-compliance with HOA Regulation 14B. Amount due, $1,200. For a long moment, David just stood there in silence. The sound of sprinklers clicking in the distance, a lawnmower whining from 2 houses away. Perfect suburban harmony, except for him. He stepped outside and looked at his yard. Tall grass brushed gently in the wind. Patches of wildflowers painted soft colors across the soil, purples, yellows, whites. A few stones bordered the small path his wife, Lisa, had once built by hand. Bees hovered lazily above her old flower beds, their faint hum like the echo of her laughter. It wasn't a lawn. It was a memory. It was the only thing left of her. After Lisa's passing 3 years ago, David couldn't bring himself to cut it down. She used to call it the living patch. She said lawns were meant to breathe, not suffocate. Every seed, every petal, every corner of that space was something she had touched. Now, the HOA wanted it gone. That evening, he sat at his kitchen table with the letter spread open, reading it again and again as if the words might change. He'd lived in this neighborhood for over 20 years, paid his dues, followed every rule, never complained. But now, they were calling his yard a nuisance. Visibly disruptive to neighborhood uniformity. Uniformity. That word stung more than the fine itself. The next morning, David walked down to the HOA office, a small, square building near the park, with perfectly trimmed hedges and artificial flowers by the door. The air inside smelled like printer ink and cheap coffee. Behind the desk sat Mr. Larson, the HOA president, clean-cut, polite, and unblinking. "Morning, David," he said. "You received the notice?" David nodded. "I did. I was hoping we could talk about it." Larson smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's a simple matter," he said, tapping his pen. "Your yard's over the height limit, and the community guidelines are clear. Uniform aesthetics preserve property values." David's jaw tightened. "It's not weeds. It's native growth, flowers my wife planted. There's clover, wild aster, milkweed for the monarchs. It's alive." Larson didn't look up. "That's not our concern. The rules apply equally to all homeowners. So what if I don't cut it?" David asked quietly. Larson paused, then shrugged. "The fines increase. And after 30 days, the association may pursue legal enforcement." Legal enforcement. Over flowers. David folded the letter and left without another word. That night, rain rolled across the neighborhood. Under flashes of lightning, he stood on his porch, staring at the garden, the rain washing over it, glistening on each leaf. The world smelled alive again. He could almost hear her voice beside him, soft, laughing, telling him to never let anyone destroy it. The next morning, another notice was taped to his door. Second warning, non-compliance. It was like they couldn't wait to break him. Every house on the street looked identical. Perfect emerald lawns, same fences, same mailboxes. David's was the only one that looked human, imperfect, real. And that made him a problem. He tried calling the HOA once more. No one answered. He emailed, requested a hearing, and got a cold response. All rulings are final. Weeks passed. Each day, another letter arrived, each one colder than the last. Until one afternoon, a contractor showed up, a young guy in a yellow vest, holding a clipboard. "Sir, we were asked to inspect your property for code violations," he said apologetically. David didn't answer. He just stood there, watching the man walk around the yard, measuring grass height, snapping pictures. To them, it was just data. To him, it was sacred ground. When the man left, David sat in his workshop, the hum of the ceiling fan blending with the low rumble of thunder outside. He looked at the photos on the wall. Lisa, smiling in her garden, dirt on her hands, sunlight in her hair. He whispered to the empty room, "They don't understand what this place means." That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept staring at the fine notice, the red ink burning into his thoughts. The word violation echoed in his head like an insult. It wasn't just about the grass. It was about control, about turning life into something sterile, predictable, dead. By dawn, his decision was made. He stepped outside as the sun rose, its golden light cutting across the dew-soaked grass. The world shimmered, every droplet glowing like glass. David took a long breath. If they wanted to call it a violation, fine. He'd give them something worth talking about. Something they couldn't find, mow, or erase. He looked at the garden one last time and murmured, "If they want uniformity, I'll give them history." The wind carried the words away into the trees. The war had begun. The next few days passed in silence. David didn't mow, didn't trim, didn't touch a single blade of grass. Instead, he watched. He listened. He planned. Every morning, the same HOA patrol car cruised by, slow, deliberate, pausing in front of his house longer than necessary. Neighbors stared from their windows, some whispering, others shaking their heads. To them, he was the man who refused to follow the rules. But to David, something far bigger was taking shape. That night, he sat down at his old computer, opened the browser, and typed 4 words into the search bar. Property preservation, legal exemptions. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but hours later, surrounded by open tabs and scribbled notes, he found it. A small clause buried deep in the state environmental code. Section 41C, Heritage Land and Ecological Restoration. It stated that any privately owned property found to contain historically native plant species or land of environmental significance could be registered as a protected ecological restoration site, meaning no one could alter, fine, or interfere with it, not even an HOA. David leaned back in his chair, heart pounding. He read the clause again, then again. Could it really be that simple? He spent the next several nights digging through archives, old maps, plant records, photos of the region before development. He found that, decades ago, his neighborhood had been part of a sprawling meadow system that fed into the state's northern wetland corridor. Lisa used to say the land had memory, that flowers could find their way back if you gave them the right soil. Now, he wondered if she'd been right all along. By the end of the week, David had a plan. He'd restore the yard, not just as a garden, but as a living record of what the land used to be. He'd plant the same native species that once thrived here, attract pollinators, rebuild the microecosystem, and document everything. If he did it right, he could apply for that state protection. And once that was approved, the HOA wouldn't just lose. They'd be forced to protect it. The thought almost made him smile. The next morning, he drove out to the county library and requested access to the Heritage Flora Index. The librarian, an elderly woman with thick glasses, handed him a dusty binder. Inside were lists of native plants, Latin names, descriptions, notes from field botanists long gone. He copied every page he could. For weeks, David worked quietly in his yard. He dug small patches, replaced invasive grass with native soil mixtures, planted seeds of wild lupin, milkweed, black-eyed Susans, and blue grama. At night, he documented everything: dates, soil pH levels, photos under natural light, even weather data. It wasn't just gardening anymore. It was evidence. Meanwhile, the HOA kept watching. Another letter arrived. This one firmer, threatening legal escalation if he didn't comply with community standards. He didn't even open it fully. He just pinned it to his wall, next to the first notice. Let them wait. One afternoon, as he was kneeling by a patch of soil, a neighbor walked by. Mrs. Crane, the one who always reported violations. She stopped at the edge of his driveway, frowning, still refusing to cut it. "Huh," she said sharply. David looked up calmly. "No," he said. "I'm growing something worth keeping." She scoffed and walked away, shaking her head. But a few days later, he noticed bees returning, more than before. Birds he hadn't seen in years perched on the fence. The ground, once dry and lifeless, began to breathe again. The garden was changing, and so was he. At night, he started drafting his application for heritage designation. It was long, technical, full of terms he barely understood, but every line mattered. He backed it with data, photographs, and citations from environmental sources. He sent it by certified mail to the State Department of Environmental Heritage, along with a personal letter explaining his project. Then he waited. Days turned into weeks. No response. The HOA's tone grew harsher. He received notice after notice. Final warning, imminent action, property hearing scheduled. But David didn't budge. He knew something they didn't. Late one night, as he sat by his window watching the wind ripple through the tall grass, headlights appeared in his driveway. The same HOA inspector stepped out, clipboard in hand, camera ready. David stayed inside, silent, watching through the curtain as the man snapped more photos. The inspector looked confused now, like he wasn't sure what he was seeing anymore. The weeds were blooming in vibrant, structured patterns. Tagged, labeled, documented. This wasn't neglect. It was intentional design. Before he left, the man took one last photo of the small wooden sign David had planted near the fence. It read, "Native Restoration Project, do not disturb." That image, David thought, would say everything later. A few mornings later, a heavy envelope arrived, thick paper, an embossed state seal on the corner. Not HOA stationery. Not a threat. Something official. His hands trembled as he tore it open. Inside was a letter. Formal. Brief. Sealed with a state insignia. It began, "We have reviewed your submission for ecological restoration classification. Following inspection and verification, your property has been deemed of heritage significance under Section 41C. Then, beneath the letterhead, a gold-stamped certificate. Protected ecological site, Carter property. David sat back in his chair, stunned. For a long time, he just stared at it, then slowly smiled. They wanted a lawn. He gave them a landmark. And this was only the beginning. The morning sun broke across the neighborhood like any other day, sprinklers ticking in perfect rhythm, lawns shimmering like green glass, every house identical and lifeless. But one home looked different now. David's. A small wooden post stood by his mailbox, carrying a fresh bronze plaque. It glinted in the light. The words engraved across it read, "Protected Ecological Restoration Site, Carter Property." He stood there, staring at it in quiet disbelief. Months of silence, work, and sleepless nights had led to this single moment. He'd won. But victory, he soon realized, was just the beginning of the storm. By noon, the HOA board already knew. Someone, maybe a neighbor, had sent them photos of the plaque. Within hours, 3 cars pulled up in front of his house, identical black sedans with the HOA emblem printed on the sides. Out stepped Mr. Larson, the same man who'd smiled through every threat letter. Only now, there was no smile. "Mr. Carter," he began, his voice sharp but forcefully polite. "We've received some concerning information. Would you care to explain what this is?" He pointed at the plaque. David folded his arms. "It's a legal designation," he said evenly. "My yard's now recognized as an ecological restoration site under state law." Larson blinked, incredulous. "You mean to tell me the state approved this mess?" David's gaze hardened. "That mess is now protected by Section 41C of the Environmental Heritage Code. I suggest you look it up." The board members exchanged looks, confusion mixed with disbelief. Larson's face reddened. "We'll be contacting our legal department," he muttered. "Do that," David replied, turning toward his door. "Just make sure they read the law before wasting everyone's time." The men left without another word, but David could feel their eyes burning into the back of his head. He knew this wasn't over. That evening, the HOA called an emergency meeting. Every resident received an email titled, "Urgent Community Matter, Attendance Required." David didn't plan to go at first, but curiosity got the better of him. When he walked into the small community hall, the room fell silent. Neighbors turned their heads. Some glared. Others avoided his eyes altogether. At the front stood Larson, pacing with a clipboard. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we're here to address a serious disruption in our community standards." A photo of David's yard appeared on the projector, wildflowers swaying under sunlight, bees hovering above, small wooden signs marking native species. Larson gestured toward it dramatically. "This is what one of our residents believes is acceptable landscaping." Despite repeated notices, he's refused compliance. And now, through some bureaucratic loophole, he's obtained a so-called heritage protection status. Whispers rippled through the room. Someone in the back said, "Is that even legal?" Larson slammed his clipboard down. "We're reviewing it. But if we let this stand, what's next? Chickens in the front yard? Goats in the driveway?" This, he pointed again, is the beginning of chaos. David slowly stood up. "Chaos," he said, his voice low but steady. "You call that chaos? That's life. That's nature finally coming back to what used to be here." Larson turned sharply. "Mr. Carter, with all due respect, your property is part of a shared aesthetic. We have standards to protect value and order." David took a step forward. "You talk about value, but you don't even see what's valuable. You paved over living land for appearances. My wife spent years restoring this soil. You called it unkept. Now the state calls it historic." A few people murmured. One woman nodded slightly. Another looked down, uncomfortable. Larson tried to cut him off. "The HOA will not be dictated to buy." But David raised his voice. "Buy what? The law? Because that's what's protecting me now. And if you're planning to fight that, I hope you're ready to explain to the press why your community standards include destroying a state-protected ecosystem." The room went quiet. Even Larson seemed to lose his footing for a second. David pulled a folded paper from his jacket, the state certificate. He held it up for all to see. "This," he said, "isn't a loophole. It's recognition. And whether you like it or not, it's permanent." He placed the document on the front desk and walked out without another word. The next morning, things changed. Reporters arrived, cameras in hand. Someone had leaked the story. HOA finds man for his yard. Loses battle after state declares it a national landmark. It spread fast, local news, then regional, then viral online. People started driving by to see it. Cars parked along the curb as families took photos near the sign. A local environmental group even sent volunteers to help David document native pollinators. Larson's calls went unanswered now. Every official he reached out to confirmed the same thing. The site was protected. The HOA couldn't find him, couldn't touch the yard. In fact, under state law, they were now obligated to maintain a 5-foot buffer zone around the property to avoid damaging it. By the end of the week, workers hired by the HOA were planting small wooden markers around David's lawn. The same association that had once fined him, now labeling it a do not disturb zone. David watched from his porch as they hammered the posts into the ground, each one feeling like a quiet apology the board would never say aloud. Neighbors who once mocked him now stopped to compliment the flowers. Kids played by the fence, chasing butterflies that hadn't been seen here in years. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. The garden spoke for itself. But deep down, David knew something was still unfinished, something larger than this single victory. He looked beyond his fence, at the endless rows of manicured lawns, and wondered, if one yard could wake up, what about the whole neighborhood? That question stayed with him long into the night, because his fight, he realized, had just begun. Months passed. The chaos faded. The media vans stopped parking along the curb. The HOA meetings grew quiet again, replaced by whispered apologies and polite silence whenever David's name came up. But his yard, it had become something more than a victory. It was alive, louder, fuller, more vibrant than ever before. The flowers had multiplied, painting the soil in wild hues of violet, amber, and blue. Birds nested in the shrubs. Butterflies drifted like fragments of sunlight, and a gentle hum of bees filled the morning air. David's home had become the only one in the neighborhood that sounded alive. He had visitors now, university students, ecologists, even school groups who came to study what he'd created. Some called it the Carter Garden. Others called it the last patch of wild. He just called it Lisa's yard. He never corrected anyone. He didn't have to, because every flower there had her memory in it. One morning, he received an official letter, this time from the State Heritage Commission. They wanted to partner with him to create a small network of native restoration sites throughout the city. He could hardly believe it. What had begun as a fight to protect a single yard was now inspiring a movement. He accepted, of course. Soon, he was consulting on small urban gardens, teaching residents how to restore native plants, how to bring life back into sterile spaces. News outlets followed his story again, but this time with admiration, not ridicule. Even the HOA, perhaps out of embarrassment, quietly started revising its community guidelines, allowing native ecological landscaping for any resident who wished to follow David's example. The same people who had once fined him were now praising him. But David didn't care for their words. He cared for the sight of bees returning to the streets, for the sound of children pointing at the butterflies that filled the air. Sometimes he'd stand by his porch, watch the wind move through the flowers, and whisper softly, "You see this, Lisa? You were right. They just needed to remember what real beauty looks like." A year later, the state invited him to a ceremony in the Capitol. He didn't expect much, maybe a handshake or a photo. But as he stood on stage beneath the tall marble columns, he heard the announcer's voice echo through the hall. For outstanding contribution to environmental preservation and community education, the Carter Ecological Site is hereby designated as a national landmark. The applause that followed blurred in his ears. He just stood there, stunned, holding the bronze plaque with shaking hands. Later, when reporters asked him how it all began, he smiled faintly and said, "It started with a fine and a promise I made to someone I loved." When he returned home, the sun was setting. The neighborhood was quiet. The air smelled of rain and wild mint. He walked down the small stone path, the one Lisa had laid all those years ago, and placed a new plaque by the wooden post. It read, "National Heritage Site, Carter Ecological Garden." He brushed the dirt from its edge and stood there for a long time, lost in thought. The world around him glowed in soft gold, every leaf shimmering, every flower bending gently in the evening breeze. He thought back to that first letter, that cold, red notice of violation. He almost laughed now. They had tried to erase his wife's memory with a fine. Instead, they turned it into a legacy. A soft rustle came from the path behind him. He turned, expecting the wind. But what he saw made his breath catch. A patch of blue lupins, Lisa's favorite, had bloomed overnight at the far edge of the yard. He hadn't planted them there. For a moment, the air shimmered with a strange quietness. The setting sun painted the flowers in glowing light, blue, deep and vivid, as if the earth itself remembered her. David knelt, touching one of the blossoms gently between his fingers. And then he noticed something half buried beneath the soil, a small, rusted tag. He pulled it free, brushing off the dirt. It was an old metal marker, the kind used decades ago for garden identification. Faded letters were still visible, etched in Lisa's handwriting. "Heritage plot number 01, begin here." David froze. He'd never seen it before. The realization hit him slowly. The heritage code, the restoration path, the boundary line. Lisa had known. All those years ago, she had already registered the soil for environmental testing. She'd started it. She'd planted the first seeds, not just of the flowers, but of the entire plan. The suspense he had lived in, the unseen hand guiding him toward victory, it wasn't luck. It was her. He looked up at the sunset, eyes glistening. The wind moved through the flowers like a whisper, soft, familiar, almost like her voice. He smiled, tears mixing with the golden light. "They fined us for our yard," he said quietly, "but you made it eternal." The camera would pull back here, a wide shot of the neighborhood. All the identical green lawns now fading into the horizon, except one. One patch of wild, bright life standing in defiance. The Carter Ecological Garden, the heart of the movement, born from love, loss, and quiet rebellion. And as the final light fades, a single line lingers on screen. She planted more than flowers, she planted the future.